I think the wording was multifactorial risk assessment. As you know, now the care of hip fractures has moved on enormously, and you have multidisciplinary teams. And I think the latest quality standard is that people are cared for within the hip fracture programme, every stage of the pathway. You've got national hip fracture audit. It's just great to see areas of care transformed like that.
In essence, don't just leave it to the orthopaedic consultant, I think is the bottom line of that guidance. You don't have to answer that.
No, I won't answer that.
When I was thinking about design drugs, benjoflumethiside or benjofluozide will be known once we've left Europe, isn't it, post-Brexit. Younger pharmacists won't remember pre-original pack days, but you used to have everything in pots of 1,000 and pots of 500. And I think it was a source of pride to a lot of pharmacists, or maybe me. You could tell a drug by its smell as well as what it looked like. And oddly, benjofluozide smelled of wee. So, it was just one of those drugs that just always fascinated me. It was obviously a complete coincidence, but it just always fascinated me.
So, Tessa, if you were in charge of the BNF and you could ban, in inverted commas, would you ban benjofluozide?
What a question. It's been a really useful drug over the years, and I know that NICE now want us to use indapamide instead. It needs to be monitored. These diuretics are relatively straightforward to use as a prescriber, and if you're explaining to somebody starting antihypertensives, you haven't got that dose titration, but you've just got to monitor them.
It comes back to the review, doesn't it? So you can't just put them on it and leave them on it until they discover that their sodium's 121 and their potassium's 2.4.
You can't get rid of it because it's a great drug to learn about as well, isn't it?
Yeah. We should put in the show notes. There's a fantastic anaesthetist, I think, does a song about benjoflumethiazide. It's very good. Okay, so talking about songs, the other thing that we're after on the Oral Apothecary is a career anthem. So how did you get on with this one?
Yes, okay. Yeah, so I did agonise over this. Not the best decision maker, personally, I would say. But so I do like to stick to the evidence. And the evidence is I'm not a huge music listener. So the song the song that I would like you to accept is the Bach Cello Suite No. 1, which really has accompanied me through my working life. I hired a cello when I first moved on to the practice patch, and I wanted to see whether it was enthusiasm to learn the cello was actually fact or fantasy. But it appeared to be a fact, and I tried straight away to start learning to play the Bach Cello Suite No. 1. And I've just plugged away in it on and off since then. Still can't master it, but it just feels very similar to general practice, really.
Can't say I'm familiar with that particular. I know Bach, obviously, but I don't know that cello suite. First person to have a classical record, so that's great. Good first for you there.
And I think we're out of copyright, aren't we? So maybe we can play that one, or maybe you could go and get your cello, Tessa, and give us it.
I couldn't possibly. There's a much more fun soundtrack of it as well. Sort of, it's by the Piano Guys, and they do a fun version of the Bach Cello Suite.
See, Richard Kahneman, and now...
Oh, see what you did there?
Well, I tell you what, I knew the guests would bring the class to the show.
Bach and Richard Kahneman have never been mentioned in the same sentence before.
Yeah, okay, you can definitely have that. That sounds like a great personal memory. We love that. And what about a book then for our listeners who do love the suggestions that our guests give us for the Oral Apothecary Library?
So I've always wondered how people manage to miss their train station. So when I was reading this book on the train, and I became that person who looks up and then swears loudly, struggles to gather all their bits and pieces together as the train leaves the station they should have got out of. Yes, so that book was, of course, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So it's a pitch to you and to your Twitter listener, Paul. He really needs to open it or finish it. And my enthusiasm for it really is because, managing common infections is all about risk. He talks so much about, it's all about cognitive biases. And one of the really key ones is availability bias, stories from friends, the media, our experience, whether it's MRSA or Clostridium, cases that come to mind. And it really influences your enthusiasm or otherwise for antibiotics.
Yeah, we definitely accept that. We love Danny Kahneman.
I was going to say we've talked about it, but I don't think we've had it.
No, we haven't. It hasn't been slotted in.
When Dr. Lawrence Brad was on, he mentioned that we don't go back enough and review System 1 thinking.
Yeah, he did say that.
That was his point, which is very subtle on that episode, and so we do need to revisit that at some point. We spend a lot of time thinking about System 2 and reflecting, but actually we don't spend enough time talking about how prescribers in particular use System 1 thinking to make the decisions.
Okay, yeah, no, you could definitely have that. It's not a replica.
Oh, I thought Jamie had it. Oh, okay.
No.
Okay, thank you. Gimmo next to introduce the micro discussion.
Well, actually, this, I think, links to Tessa's desert island drug quite nicely. That is a coincidence, I think. But it's so what I want to discuss is the recent paper in the British Journal of General Practice on potentially inappropriate primary care prescribing in people with chronic kidney disease. You know, I'm interested in this work because as part of the medicine safety programme I was involved in before COVID, you know, we identified that one of the biggest sort of reasons people are admitted to hospital for potentially drug-related harm was because of, AKA, due to the medicines that people are taking, and you know, the medicines, we've mentioned them, such as diuretics, ACE inhibitors, NSAIDs and that sort of thing. And so what the paper says is that, well, it concludes that potentially inappropriate prescribing is common at all stages of chronic kidney disease. Development and evaluation of interventions to improve prescribing safety in this high-risk population are needed. And so the paper really is a good explanation of some of the causes, some of the evidence and prevalence around it, and then explores some of the potential solutions. So I assume you've all had a chance to look at it. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I thought it was a really interesting study and, you know, very relevant and based in Scotland. So some of the drugs you won't be surprised about. A lot of people will be aware of. So things like not using nitrofurantoin if you've got a low EGFR and metformin. I thought there was some drugs that you might have a bit of a discussion about.
Aspirin.
Yes. But there's some really important messages there, I think, for us. I was particularly interested in the opiates. I think that's probably my biggest learning point and something I'd be really interested in taking back. And I suppose what my other bit was about, interesting, they didn't mention trimethoprim. I assume that might be partly because of measuring problems. They said they couldn't look out for all the drugs they wanted to. But I know that's been quite a cause for concern about hospital admissions. Janet Thomas, I know she's mentioned there's been concern, and I think a lot of GPs probably aren't familiar with the fact that if you've got somebody with CKD4, so EGFR 15 to 30, you need to use half the dose after 3 days.
Janet Thomas from Wrexham, if you're listening, she's done an enormous amount of work in this area. So hi, Janet.
And I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? That there's nothing new in here. Okay, for us that are interested in therapeutics and drug safety, there's nothing new. But the point that they make, and we need to get on with very quick, I think, is how are we going to help people to do this? Because there is so much alert fatigue. And there are so many things that you have to check on. But it is fundamental because people are living longer and their kidney deteriorates by definition. And again, coming back to review, if you don't review something that was started 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and now their renal function has deteriorated, DOACs being a classic example. So I think for me, the best part of the whole article was we need to crack on and get some really good, simpler ways of helping prescribers in primary care to identify this so that we can stop those problems from occurring.
Yeah, and I think because it was interesting, one of the things it mentioned was alert fatigue, but then in the video that accompanied it, the researcher actually said, but she still thinks that alerts are the solution. And I was thinking about it. I think what she meant was when she talks about alert fatigue, she's talking about these pop-up things that pop up on your computer to say, beware, this drug may contribute to, you know, such and such. And people just scroll past them because they see so many of them. Whereas I think the alerts that may have value, and there's some research done on this, is the sort of AKI alerts that come back based on a sort of an overall risk assessment of a patient based on their readings and all their drugs and their conditions. And these alerts are used a lot in secondary care, but I don't think they're fed back so much to primary care, and I wonder if that's one of the areas we need to be looking at.
I mean, it's so much easier to work out creatinine clearance in primary care than it is in secondary care. And what's disappointing about this article actually is they keep going on about EGFR, whereas actually for nearly all drugs, all this stuff about renal clearance is still based on creatinine clearance, not on EGFR. But I don't want to get into the negative aspects of it. I see that we need to have a fix, almost like the HIV drug interaction checker, the Liverpool one. Everybody seems to know about that. Everybody seems to know that if you're going to prescribe antiretrovirals or you've got somebody on them, you don't do anything until you've checked there first. Do you see what I mean? That the simplicity of that. People know they've got that message. How did they do that?
I was just going to pick up on the coding side of things. I think there's other work suggesting that if we code better, that people have got CKD, you're more likely to pick up the interactions, and I understand that it leads to fewer hospital admissions. The other thing is, non-steroidals I'm sure we could be better at monitoring those regularly. I'm not sure everyone gets a renal function test who's given a non-steroidal.
I'm not sure it's covered in the paper, but us three are pharmacists, often focus on the drugs. One of the things we were looking at is, do we really focus enough on the hydration issues and on things like sick day rules and stuff like that? Because that's often a major contributing factor, whereas when you look at the coding, when it goes into hospital, it's all about the drug, isn't it? Not necessarily the frailty and hydration or the conditions that person was living in before they were admitted that might have contributed to it as well.
So I think what will be shouting out into your earphones if you're listening to us right now is, it's about medication review.
Well, this is the podcast. I mean, I'm coming at it from a slightly different tack, and I didn't know that Tessa was going to pick Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, as her book for the library. And so I was drawn to the sentence, really, however, the finding that clinicians are commonly expected to use clinical judgment in the face of minimal evidence is an important one in its own right. And it describes some of the warnings in the BNF that they are quite vague and ambiguous because of the evidence is vague and ambiguous. But it brings me on to, I've just started reading Daniel Kahneman's latest book called Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. And so, Paul, if you're listening again, you've got, crack on, because there's another one to plough through. It's a bit of a beast. But where there's judgment, there is noise, and more of it than you think. And Daniel Kahneman is bringing us this, and just as we've got used to cognitive biases in our decision-making, he talks of decision hygiene, and that noise in that system is when people are supposed to be interchangeable in terms of their roles actually give very different answers to the same problem. And so that is what we're faced with. On the WhatsApp group, as part of the engine room of this podcast, I did put a paper on about how statin prescribing changes from 8 o'clock in the morning on clinic to mid-afternoon. And again, that variability really shouldn't be there. So I'm just introducing you to Kahneman's latest works. It's going to be an interesting one. I've just started reading it. Well, thank you, Tessa, and thanks for the discussion. Another interesting area. A big thank you to Tessa for joining us on the Oral Apothecary and for sharing her desert island drug, her career anthem, and her book. Coming up next time, we'll be joined by Jill Cruikshank. Jill is a community pharmacist, coach, trainer, and speaker from Edinburgh. So we're looking forward to catching up with Jill next time on the podcast. Over to Gimmer now for our contact details and the final ingredient.
Thanks, Tessa. That's fantastic. So contact details, again, engage with us on Twitter at Oral Apothecary or email us oralapothecarypod@gmail.com. We're grateful for everyone who listens, and if you do like it, leave us a review or share it with your friends and colleagues. Well, a bit of a social media shout out first. I'm just thinking, actually, Tessa, do you know a pharmacist called Lisa Riley?
No, I don't think so.
That's all right then, because Lisa Riley on Twitter, she said she's a bit freaked out because she's listened to the Oral Apothecary. She went to uni with Jonathan Underhill, and then she worked at the Mailer with Karen Sankey, so she's wondering who's next. We're not stalking you, Lisa, but I thought I would just check. The final ingredient this week, I wanted to, if I were to say to you, 5-H2TO serotonin receptor partial agonist, then what would you say? If I were to say to you, tune in, turn on, drop out, what would you say?
Oh, I know that one.
So today's final ingredient is about the growing field of research for the use of psychedelics to treat depression. There isn't much room in the market for a new antidepressant, but perhaps there is some room for a mushroom. And joking aside, we talked about depression last week and how it is poorly served by drugs. And there was a programme on BBC Two last night about psilocybin, which is derived from magic mushrooms, being trialled to treat chronic depression. It seems to be showing promising results. So the study in question was actually published in the New England Journal of Medicine, a trial of psilocybin versus I can't pronounce it. I'm nervous pronouncing drugs in front of Steve. Escitalopram for depression. And the trial did report that on the basis of change in depression scores at week 6, it did show a significant difference in antidepressant effects. As with most claims, and this was a short trial and a small trial, you've got to treat them with a lot of caution and read between the headlines. But I just thought it was interesting. And on the face of it, a magic mushroom does have the potential to make you more of a fun guy.
This was a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough. Original music Jamie Brewster. Artwork by David Baker.
Thanks for listening to the Oral Apothecary podcast. Warning, may colour urine.
This episode of the Oral Apothecary is sponsored by jamiehayes.co.uk.